Welcome to our YouTube podcast this morning from St Andrews. We're continuing with our series, Why Bother with Church? And this morning we're going to be looking at the theme, How Can I Survive Church? How can I survive church? And we'll be focusing on the verses from Jesus' prayer, beginning at John 16:33 and finishing at John 17:5. It's Jesus' prayer just after the Last Supper with his disciples. It's a beautiful prayer. But I want to just say before I continue, the theme, how to survive church, is very necessary, but it's not just about how to survive. So this week we'll be looking at how to survive church, and next week we'll be looking at how to love church, because actually that is ultimately the goal, that we love. It doesn't just become duty, it is about delight. So how to survive church? The word survival is a bit like climbing a mountain, and when you're going off into the wild to climb a mountain or into the jungle or whatever, it's all about getting the essentials right. You want to travel light, so you want to put in your backpack just the things that you need. You don't want all the extra baggage holding you down. So today, a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about is the essence, the essentials. What makes church worth it? How do we get through it in the long haul? Jersey is one of the most strangest places for church. It's a really small island, about 9 miles by 5 miles, and there are just so many churches. I think at the last count there are about 72 churches. That includes your mainstream denominations, Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, your free churches, your house churches. When you add them all up, it's a crazy amount of churches. And as a result, you get a lot of stories of hurt. A lot of stories where people have said, and I've heard these many times, people have said to me, yeah, we were going to this one church and we just got burnt out and we had to move. Or we just got burnt out and we stopped going to church altogether. And there are sometimes really good reasons for that. We got this new vicar and we just didn't really get on with him, and so we stopped going to church. And we kept getting snapped at by that church warden, and so we stopped going to church. I was on the youth rota and the flower rota every weekend, and you know what? I never ever got a weekend to myself. I never saw my children. So we stopped going to church, and my children don't go to church as a result. And that's very sad, but we have to confront these stories because they're real and they're true. And sometimes, quite often, as a church, we get these things wrong. But I want to just say for a moment that whenever I hear stories like that, as good and understandable as many of those reasons are, what I never hear is someone say to me, the reason I stopped going to church was because of Jesus Christ. The reason I stopped going to church was that Jesus guy who kept winding me up week on week, and then eventually I snapped. And I just couldn't take it anymore. That Jesus guy, he was awful. I never hear that. I never hear that as the reason. It's always the vicar or the warden or the way the service was or the music or something else. Something arguably secondary to why we're there in the first place. Jesus Christ. And as a vicar, I've realized two hard, cold truths. Not that I've been a vicar very long, but these cold, hard truths have really come out strong to me. And the first one is this: you can't please everyone. You just can't please everyone. You shouldn't even try to please everyone. You never will, particularly if you've got a really a larger congregation. You'll never please everyone. But if you're not disappointing some people, you're not doing your job right. Because you have to be making difficult choices for the whole of the community, rather than just individuals who shout the loudest. And so you make changes all the time. You're looking inside the church, but you're also looking outside the church because culture changes. And so you're adapting. The gospel message stays the same, but you're learning to communicate it in a different and new languages as you go. So you have to make changes. So if you're not disappointing some people, you're not doing your job, because nobody likes change. It's uncomfortable. And so, this is just a reality of what church is about. Church is about change and becoming more adaptable. But the hope is that if you introduce change gradually, you actually make people more resilient. And that doesn't always work, but it's what I do. As opposed to just perpetuating them in what makes them comfortable. The few who like their service in a certain way, and that doesn't change for 50 years. I don't think that's very healthy. But in my experience, there is today, when we look at church, a cultural spectrum. On the one hand, we can call ourselves a Christian and have a utopian dream of church. Okay. Sunday worship is the main event for me and my faith. The problem is that if you hold an attitude like this, then if it doesn't measure up to your expectations, you either get bitter and twisted, you write dodgy letters to the vicar, or you move around a lot. Let's chop and choose churches as I go, like a smorgasbord. We'll take a bit here, we like the worship there, we like the sermon there, we like the prayers there. We'll just drop in, we'll pick and choose as we like. And, I've overheard conversations like this. Some of them have been leveled at me. People say, "Oh, why can't you be more like the last vicar? He was amazing. He did this and this and this," and, or indeed, the last vicar was a nightmare. But now the Lord has sent you. All our prayers are answered. We'll have a revival. Yeah, isn't that wonderful? No pressure. And then if you get it wrong as a vicar, you become very self-orientated, always comparing yourself to other vicars or other churches, It's not about me. But that's the utopian dream of church. But you can also have the dystopian dream of church. Recently, our co-steering club was about to set out, and we were standing in the car park putting on our wetsuits, getting ready for our next co-steer, and this couple drove into the car park, and they got out and they were on holiday, and they saw me getting suited up, and it turned out they were South African. So I just got talking to them, and the lady said, "So what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Church of England minister." And she said, "Oh, you don't look like a Church of England minister," because I was in a wetsuit and everything else. And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess perhaps I don't. I don't know if there's a stereotype for all of that." And she said, "But I get it now." So I said, "What? What do you get?" She said, "I guess you Church of England ministers have to start becoming more creative because nobody goes to church anymore." Well, nobody goes to church anymore? I said, "Well, actually, can I just correct you there? People do go to church. Quite a few people go to church. But the dystopian idea of church is that it's old-fashioned, it's irrelevant. I don't need that. And we have all these assumptions of what church is, but we never go to check out those assumptions anyway. Did you know that more people go to church than who go to football matches in Britain? Did you know that? Statistically, more people go to church than who attend football matches in Britain. I believe that both the utopian idea of church is the main event, it's got to be perfect, and the dystopian idea of church are wrong. And the evidence of how modern and postmodern culture have led us up the garden path. We need to be thinking differently about church if we're going to survive. In our Bible reading today, Jesus is at the Last Supper with his disciples, and he's talking about their future mission to start the church. And he says, John 16:33, it's just a wonderful passage. He says, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you'll have trouble. How can you have trouble and peace in the same sentence? I don't know. We'll unpack that. And he carries on. He said, "But take heart. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." It's actually a very strange thing to say. Most generals at the start of a great battle would say, "Okay, chaps, okay, soldiers, gather together. This is going to be a tough one, but I'll be with you and we'll fight together. We shall overcome together. Yeah." That's the courage speech. Once more unto the breach. Jesus says, if you read the whole of chapter 16, "I'm leaving you, and you are going to have trouble." Most of the people he's talking to died young in horrible ways. Just read the book of Acts. But he says, rest assured, everything is going to be okay, because I've already won the battle. See how different that is to the classic courage speech that a general gives just before his troops are running into battle? And if you read the book of Acts, or you read the history of the early church, one to check out is Eusebius. Eusebius' History of the Church. It's amazing. The first 3 centuries of the Christian church. It was written very long time ago. It's not simply that you have people, why did the church grow? It's not simply that you had people who were loving and kind and courageous, etc., etc., and that was attractive. It's more than that. It's that you have these examples of courage and kindness and love and forgiveness and everything in places that you really shouldn't have them. They look attractive because they're so out of place, because everything else around them is unkind, unloving, vicious, brutal, violent. That's the sort of society that the church grew out of. So you have these examples of amazing kindness, courage, love, and everything else in places where you really shouldn't have them. Hope in places that seem hopeless. The church is a really dangerous place, but as churches develop and become more established, the church becomes the tallest building in the village and the spire for the traveller to see, because the traveller on a long journey in a very dangerous world would know that if he got to the church, he would be assured of a peaceful, restful night's sleep, because the church was a place of sanctuary. Or you have joy in places that are normally filled with sadness. How can you sing songs in a Roman prison cell? You've got to be mad to sing a song in somewhere as brutal and as violent and awful as a Roman prison cell. Joy in places that are normally filled with sadness. And you have peace in places that are just chaos. If you read about the plague of Gallon, 165 AD, it was an awful smallpox virus that swept across Rome. And Gallon was a physician, and he's writing a first-hand account of his experience. And everyone in Rome who was rich, who could afford it, the elites, all left for the countryside, leaving the poor to just die in their filth in the city. But the church made a conscious effort to stay behind and nurse the sick. And Gallon actually records, as Gallon's not a Christian, but he records how the church stayed behind. And as it turned out, many church members died because they contracted the smallpox. But those who survived became stronger. The church became stronger afterwards. And because many who they treated, who weren't Christians before, actually were so blown away by the love that they ended up joining the church. And actually out of those plagues, the church grew. Perhaps we can learn something in the current COVID crisis. I don't know. Courage in places that were filled with fear. You read these stories. I remember being in the Ukraine, and I went to teach a summer camp, English Bible summer camp there for 2 weeks. And I was really quite shocked at how, war-torn the Ukraine is. There's bullet holes. You go into these little villages and there's bullet holes everywhere and everything else. But one of the things that really shocked me was we're driving quite late at night. We drove for about 8 hours to get to this village from Hungary. And, if you go into normal cities, occasionally you see prostitutes, on the streets, and you feel quite desperate. These young girls, like, parading their bodies out on the streets. But what horrified me about the Ukraine, and a place is pretty evil when this happens. We were driving out on country roads late at night in the middle of nowhere, right in the sticks, and there, out in the middle of these country roads, were young girls just standing on the roadside. And you even ask the driver, you say, "Well, why don't we just can we give them a lift anywhere? What are they doing out there in the middle of nowhere?" He said, "No, they don't want a lift from you. They're selling their bodies out in the dark, in the cold, in the middle of absolute nowhere." That's a really dark place. But I took this Bible camp for a week, and we met these people in my class. They were sort of 20-something-year-olds who were studying to become teachers. And one day they said to me, "We're going to take you apple picking." And I said, "Oh, okay. I don't know if apple picking? All right, okay." And we went to this one person's house. And I remember it was just a rundown old farmhouse. But at the back of the house, there was this beautiful apple orchard. And I spent an afternoon. And the sun was shining. And it was one of the most beautiful, heavenly experiences I think I've possibly ever had. And it was like light in a place that was very dark. And the light shone all the more brighter because of the atmosphere of darkness and fear around. And I always remember that. It just completely sticks in my head. It's like a little glimpse of heaven. This beautiful apple orchard in the sun with these wonderful, courageous people. There is a wonderful example of art from, I think he's probably the greatest graphic artist of the 20th century. His name is Shigeru Fukuda, and he did a piece of art called Lunch with Helmet On, and there's a picture of it there, you'll see it. And it's an ugly mass of rusty knives and forks and spoons all welded together at random. And if you are a utopian art critic, you might look at this ugly mess and say, "Oh, come on, can't, what are these artists, these modern arts today? It's all abstract. Give me a Caravaggio any day, because that's real art." I'd say that sometimes I'm a bit of an art dinosaur, but anyway. But if you're a dystopian art critic, you might look at this ugly mass of knives and forks and spoons and go, "Hey, wow, man, that reflects real life. It's deep, man. Yeah, you know how artists speak or whatever," and get all like dystopian about it and revel in your dystopianness of it. But actually, if you're a utopian or dystopian, when you look at this piece of art, you're missing the point entirely. Because what if, when you shine a light at a different angle onto this sculpture, you get a beautiful shadow? Do you see the picture now? Do you see how the picture changes? Do you see now why the piece of art is called Lunch with Helmet On? And do you see now that every rusty knife, fork and spoon is set in exactly the right place it was meant to be, but only when the light shines at just the right angle? And I believe that is a wonderful illustration of church. Church can so often be just a mass of hurt and people dealing with horrendous things, all brought together and welded together. And it can look like a mess, but every now and again we see a glimpse of heaven as the light turns and shines just at the right place. We get a glimpse, but it doesn't last. It's always temporary. But one day, at the end of time, when Christ returns, I believe that the light will stay on. And that shadow, making that wonderful shadow sculpture, will actually become more real burn the rusty sculpture behind. I want you to just hold that notion as a notion of church, because when you see church that way, then if you have a utopian dream of church, it should dissolve, and if you have a dystopian dream of church, that should dissolve too. But if we now apply that back to our church experience, what do we get? Well, let's ask, what are these first early Christians who were doing church in a really dangerous way and a very dangerous place? What did they know about church? Well, they knew that no matter how fragile or pathetic the church looked on any given day, no matter or even no matter how glorious and wonderful it looked on any other day, they knew that what they were witnessing was not a utopia or dystopia, but a small piece of an eternal puzzle that had already been mapped out. Jesus says, in this world, you will have trouble. It's gonna be messy, chaps. But I have overcome the world. I have dealt with the sins of your past. And my Spirit is with you in the present. And the future is going to be way better and glorious than you can possibly imagine. Right now, you just see a little bit. You see. When you grasp that about church, it's actually very liberating. You realize the church wasn't invented by you and certainly doesn't rely on you for its existence. And so you become more open to change. At times, as time moves on, the church must speak in new languages, as I said. But not just the language that you find most accessible. But you also don't need to keep on pandering to every latest fad. There's a lovely quote from a vicar called Reverend Inge. He said, "Whoever marries the spirit of his age will find himself a widower in the next." You become less focused on programs and goals and money and more focused on people and relationships and prayer. You begin to imagine that ordinary, everyday little things might turn out to be extraordinary things in the light of eternity. That little silly conversation that you wasted your precious time on with the person who was different to you, who wound you up. And you can also take a break. I say this to people a lot. If church is getting, if you're starting to feel like you're burning out, take a break. Come and talk to me and say, I just want to take a break from church in the moment. I'm dealing with something personal in my life and I'm struggling and I just don't have the energy. That's okay. You can step back. The church will carry on. The church will be fine. Jesus has got the church. You can take a break. You don't just get all that from words or funny art illustrations. From day one, the church has always been built on a phenomenal but very strange foundation. Jesus says, I've told you these things so that in me you might have peace. In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And then verse 17, Jesus looked up. He looked towards heaven and he prayed, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. This word glory, man, it's a crazy word. In Greek and Roman culture, the word glory meant honor, high renown. Think the Olympics. England winning a football match. Sorry, that was a cheap joke. I don't mean it. But glory in this context, that word used in this context, equals humiliation, torture, and death. Remember, this is the night before Jesus is about to be arrested, tried, and crucified. The hour has come for glory. But this is the very opposite of glory. How can Jesus possibly be glorified through agonizing, humiliating death? How is God glorified? By the death of his Son. The disciples who witnessed the crucifixion, they remember, Jesus says, in me you'll have peace. But how they get peace? From witnessing a crucifixion. Take heart, I have overcome the world. As they witness the crucifixion, surely they must interpret this as precisely not Jesus overcoming the world, but the trouble of the world overcoming Jesus. How do you get the inspiration and the courage and the motivation of the early church out of crucifixion? Out of that kind of glory? How is it glorious? How do you make a symbol of sheer terror? How do you turn that into a symbol of hope and peace? Christians say all the time, don't they? Jesus saves. But most of us fail to appreciate is that gargantuan paradox within that statement. If you go to church, you have to realize that the cross is irreducible. How can you get more outrageous than God on a cross? You can't make this stuff up, and you can't get rid of it, because that's precisely what the cross symbolized. The Romans tried to get rid of him, but they couldn't. It's irreducible. And out of that foundation for church, you get three things. And I tell you what, these things are bulletproof. They are completely indestructible, and that's why they will last forever in eternity. Well, number one, there's no experience in this life that you will face that God hasn't already faced. He truly did walk in your shoes, and coming to church will broaden your perspective by enabling you to encounter some of those other life experiences that human beings go through. Human beings who also believe that there's no experience that God hasn't already faced. So being in church, you experience that more. Jesus walked in your shoes. But secondly, God can work through impossible darkness to achieve extraordinary light. That's a hard one to grasp. That is a hard one to grasp when you're living through impossible darkness. And all I can say is, it's true. That's what the cross is all about. It's true. That's what the church has believed right the way through. And thirdly, every piece of this church thing, no matter how pathetic, is there for a reason, even if you can't see the reason right now. Again, very hard to grasp, but it's true. It's just true, okay? That's all I can say for now. If you're coming to church each week, bitter and twisted, trying desperately to figure out this weird thing we call church, then just take a break. It's far too big for you to figure out this side of heaven. But it's also far too wonderful for you to miss this side of heaven. Because when it works, in all its mess, we get a little glimpse of what heaven is really about. In now, but not yet. So don't miss out. Take a break, but come back. Take a break, but come back. I've told you these things so that in me, in Christ, you might have peace. In this world you'll have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world. After Jesus said this, he looked towards heaven and he prayed, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may be glorified in you. Amen.